sign-in table at the front, right outside the door here, so make sure that you check in for that. This all came about basically as part of our Kings Basin Water Authority integrated regional water management planning processes, and just some continued strategies that we have in developing information and public information and outreach materials. This particular symposium has been put on in large part by, or supported in large part by the California Water Foundation. And you'll hear from them at lunchtime today as to what their interest is in this region and how they've been supportive, and I believe will continue to be supportive in resource management planning for the San Joaquin Valley. But this particular project started with a proposal that we submitted, that we developed some education and outreach tools to really inform the broader audience of resource managers within the Kings Basin to start looking at opportunities to more directly bridge or connect groundwater management, and you'll hear more from me on that later. At the time we pursued this, we didn't anticipate the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act of 2014, but it's now part of life. But our intent was to bridge groundwater management, surface water management, and land use planning and management into a more direct collaborative effort to achieve some of our basin balance goals. So the purpose and objectives of today, and then I'm going to introduce our first speaker, are to really continue and build on a dialogue that you'll find over the course of the morning has been occurring for a number of years. In some areas I've considered it a secret that people just haven't really understood how integrated planning works, what its intent and objectives are, and how we've tried to apply that in the Kings Basin. So we'll do some education there, some discussion of pros and cons and challenges that presents, and hopefully meet the meeting objectives of building and continuing this dialogue. So with that, I'd like to introduce our opening speaker, Dr. Hanak. Is going to present for the first few minutes this morning. Ellen is a senior fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. She's been with PPIC since 2001 and become very involved in discussions about water policy and water-related issues. PPIC has done a number of water publications that I think have really informed the public policy discussion both in Sacramento as well as nationally. Ellen holds a PhD in economics from the University of Maryland. I will point out that bios for all of our speakers and panelists are in the inside of the back binder sleeve. So if anybody wants more information, please refer to those. And with that, Ellen, thank you so much for being here this morning.
Challenge. Is this? Can you hear me well? Okay. Good morning, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be with you today. I'm going to break with my usual reliance on the crutch of PowerPoint and just talk off of some notes and talk a little bit about some context for thinking about the linkages between water and land use planning, and specifically focus on California, but just want you to know that this is something that is really kind of west-wide, some of the things I'm going to be talking about. So there are a lot of examples from other neighboring and other western states as well that are relevant, and I'm happy we have some time for questions to talk about that as well. And maybe first start with just the issue of why linking water and land use decisions matters. Probably, especially given the drought, everybody's especially thinking about quantity, and that is one of the main reasons that people think about the importance of linking these two resource decisions. One of them is, and the one that I'm going to mostly talk about for the rest of the talk, is making sure that there's enough water available to support residents and businesses' long-term investments. And this is kind of making sure that if somebody's going to build in a place, they get the permits and everything, and it doesn't turn out that it's a dry lot. If it's just, thinking about an individual, but thinking about communities where you have both residents and businesses, that there's enough water available to support the expected life of the different kinds of investments that you would make. There's also a quantity issue in thinking on the too much water side with respect to flood planning, and there are a certain number of regulations that are in place to, and that's actually linked to federal legislation, federal law, about not having people build things in places that are very highly flood prone, or having certain kinds of restrictions on what can be done, what heights of buildings and so on, what heights for the first floors to keep them out of harm's way from flooding. More recently, people have also been really starting to think about water storage issues in relation to land use decisions, and that's really a question of making sure that we're not building and hardening places that are good recharge areas for groundwater recharge. And then there's also been attention more recently to some quality issues, and here I'd say mainly it's about what happens with drainage, and in particular polluted runoff. And so in urban areas there's been a lot of focus on thinking about how you make sure that the first flush, for example, from a storm doesn't all run off on the streets and right into the rivers with all kinds of pollutants in it. So finding ways to sort of have land use planning and decisions link up to manage the water quality side of things. Now, those all seem like kind of common sense things that ought to just happen, that the linkages ought to just be there, because of course we don't want to put houses where there's no water, or put people very, very much in harm's way with flooding and so on. But the linkage doesn't automatically happen, and now I just want to especially talk about the water quantity side, because of very separate authorities for who makes the decisions. Cities and counties in California, and that's true elsewhere pretty much throughout the country, in the U.S., are the ones that have the land use permitting decisions. And here we're talking about any kind of building permits and development permits for residential and for business and industrial uses. And it's water supply agencies and departments that have the responsibilities to deliver the water supply. And even in places where it's all under one mayor and one city council, there's a water department and there's a planning department, there's not necessarily been a historical connection in the decisions that get made between those two departments. And when it's different agencies, as it often is in California, where you've got a special district that's doing the water supply, and a city or county that's doing the land use permitting, then there's really no automatic way that they're going to talk to each other unless they feel like it. Or at least that's been what the law did not require any kind of automatic connection between them. And there's, you would think, okay, well, cities and county decisions on land use, of course they're going to want to include considerations of water supply availability when they make those decisions, even if they're not the ones that are in charge of water supply. But they won't necessarily have the technical information for that. And then they will often be faced with pressures by folks whose decision-making horizons are shorter than those long-term investments that kind of the community wants to protect. And so the classic example of that is a real estate developer who is going to build something, sell it, and then it's not his or her problem whether 5 years from now there's water available for the community. And it's also the case, and so there's some sort of political science research on this, suggesting that politicians, even though a lot of times they are from the community and they have they live in the community, they in a sense have the community's long-term interests at heart, they're under short-term election pressures and can, for that reason, sometimes be inclined to make decisions that have a more short-term horizon relative to what the community as a whole might want for some of these long-term resource management issues. Now, when we think about the role of groundwater in this, it adds an added complication, because if groundwater is managed as an open access resource, that's kind of an additional factor where if everybody's able to pump from the basin, nobody's necessarily minding the shop in terms of making sure that that resource is available on a long-term basis. So where you see regulation having come in to look at the links between water and land use in a lot of western states where there's a lot of groundwater dependency and not a lot of surface water availability, that's kind of where it's coming first, because people have recognized that there's a real problem in terms of the long-term availability of the groundwater basin to support residential development and urban development. So that's a little bit of background. Now, talk a little bit about California's laws in this area. We really started requiring a linkage between water supply and land use, I would say in 2001. There was some earlier legislation that was kind of not very effective. So the real starting point is 2001. There were a couple of laws passed. Both Senate bills, Senate Bill 221 and Senate Bill 610, and they are known affectionately or unaffectionately, depending on whether it's working for you or not, as the Show Me the Water laws. And what they did, this was legislation sponsored by Jim Costa from here in the Valley and Sheila Kuehl from southern coastal California. What these laws did was require, before a large development can be approved, that the city or county that's providing the permit for approval for that development gets the okay of the local water agency that there's enough water available to support that community for at least 20 years. And I'll just say that 20 years is a short horizon compared to what a lot of other states use. Arizona uses 100 years, for example. In most counties in New Mexico, it's above 50 or above. But 20 years was considered the horizon in California, and that was not because they thought that it was a good idea that it was fine that water could run out after 20 years. It was more just that that's a typical horizon for realistic planning of water supply on the part of water supply agencies, that they can kind of, they're often planning further out, but those are sort of the horizons under which they have a nearer term idea of what they're investing in and how they're going to be mobilizing new supplies. So this came on the books in late 2001, and the requirement applies to developments that are 500 units or more, or in smaller communities, anything that would increase municipal and industrial water demand by at least 10% relative to the existing demand. So at the time, people felt, well, this is, some people felt that this was maybe too big of a threshold, but that was kind of the compromise that was arrived at with the Building Industry Association. And there was some fear that there were going to be loopholes with a lot of 499 unit developments and so on that wouldn't have to apply that law. But what the law does, it's kind of, in a way, it's a safety net, because it doesn't say that local jurisdictions can't look closer at smaller developments. It's just kind of saying that they must for these larger ones. So I've done some research on this. We came out with a study in 2005, so 4 years after the law passed, and then we did some updating of that in 2010, sort of see how it's going. And what we found was that, by and large, it's working, in the sense that you're not seeing the 499 unit loophole kinds of things. In most cases, the way this is being looked at by, because the water agencies are working really in collaboration with the city and county authorities on this, they're not looking at it as a strict 20-year availability. They're tending to look at it in terms of, what's the long-term availability going to be. You're rarely seeing this blocking new development. What you're seeing is sometimes downsizing, but I would say more often than not, it's kind of been encouraging a different way of thinking. It's been encouraging the cities and counties to negotiate with the developers and the proponents of the large projects on how can they be more water smart. So you get a lot of projects that will kind of do some extra conservation measures, They might be more inclined to use purple pipes and build in recycled water use if that's available in the community. Various kinds of ways in which they're kind of negotiating to be, I don't know, greener for to use sort of the common term. And going above and beyond what the minimum in the building code provides. In Colorado and New Mexico, where this was really a concern for what was going on with the use of groundwater reserves in places that were not easily rechargeable, you see that these laws have encouraged some shifting of development where people are less likely to be building on lots outside of the municipal areas and more likely to be building in places that are hooked up to the municipal areas, which are bigger and more able to kind of make sure that they're bringing in supplies in one way or another from various sources. And I'll say that in general, in groundwater-dependent areas that have water supply limits, the principle that gets applied when people are doing this well is you're looking for ways to either bring in alternative sources or transfer water locally within the basin in order to support new growth. So you see this kind of these water transfers happening in Colorado. I think actually here in the San Joaquin Valley, there's been a certain amount of local water transfers where some of the irrigation districts have been engaged in long-term water transfers to support urban and suburban development, especially further north of here, but also in various places in the valley. Now, I'll also say, just sort of looking at the overall picture, that we did find some weaknesses and gaps, and those tend to be, especially in places that have small utilities that are not really doing the kind of sophisticated multi-decade planning that the larger urban utilities are doing, and also in places where there's not really citizen oversight. And by that I mean, people in the community that are caring about this stuff and watching and kind of holding the agencies accountable. And that's important because this is the only way that you actually enforce these laws. These are laws. California has a lot of planning laws like this that are on the books, and they basically enable citizens to sue the local public agency if they're not doing what the law says. And that is the state does not come in itself and enforce this. So there have been some suits, and lawsuits are, you don't need to have a lawsuit everywhere for agencies to more generally start complying. So that has been useful, but I would say in places that are growing faster, often those are places that have smaller utilities and maybe less of an organized community that's already engaged in wanting to make sure that it's all done right. Now, another piece of California's water and land use linkage comes through the water planning side, and here again I'm going to mainly focus on the urban areas where there's been the most legislation and development of practice. And we have an Urban Water Management Planning Act, which came into being in 1983, I think. So this requires urban agencies that are supplying have at least 3,000 connections. Is it 3? Yeah, I'm going to 3,000 connections, or about 10,000 acre feet. Is that the? Now comes the problem of not having my slides. Anyway, about 3,000 households. They have to do this planning every 5 years, and there have been progressively more and more things added to what needs to be looked at in these plans. In the beginning, they were tiny little things. They tend to sometimes now be large with a number of appendices and everything. They're usually not the main planning document of an agency. They're usually just a way of organizing information in a way that can be used for comparison purposes by the state along with the agency's long-term capital plan. And I did a review of these for the 2000 round, and what we found was that there were a lot of holes in them, a lot of non-compliers in terms of not submitting the plans, a lot of holes in the data, and also a lot of problems in the data. If you added up all of the projections of supply for California as a whole, you found that a lot of agencies were expecting to get water from, retail agencies were expecting to get water from either groundwater or from wholesale agencies where it wasn't at all clear that the groundwater was going to be there or that the wholesale agencies were going to be providing that water. And in particular, in the San Joaquin Valley, there was a projection of close to 1 million acre-feet of additional water over 20 years that urban development was going to use, which was a concern insofar as it wasn't, there were already concerns about overdraft in the basins. So in the 2000s, it became required to add information about groundwater overdraft, and if there was overdraft, how was that going to be dealt with in terms of thinking about long-term supplies for the urban areas. And that reporting has definitely improved and probably in some ways shed some additional light on some of the groundwater vulnerabilities of some communities. These urban water management plans were set up timing-wise to be able to be used as a way of proving up your long-term supply as part of the other laws I mentioned, the Show Me the Water laws. And that turns out to look like it's working pretty well in the sense that urban water management plans, they're done right. They usually go out a little bit longer now, so they go out 25 years typically, so they can be used for the whole 5-year interim period for any new development. And they tend to build in any foreseen development, so there's a lot more coordination with the cities and the counties. So that's sort of the picture on the urban and suburban and residential, municipal, and industrial development. Now I just want to wrap up with a few thoughts on next steps, which I know everyone here in the Valley and in other parts of California where there's a lot of dependency on groundwater are thinking about what happens with the new groundwater law legislation and how does that fit in with this. And also, I haven't really talked about agriculture, but where does that fit into this picture, given that agriculture is an important user of groundwater too? And I think here in the Valley in particular, there's been a kind of shift in the equation. There's been these laws that I spoke about have been concerned about the long-term investments related to municipal and industrial investments, but there's been an important shift toward tree crops in agriculture, which is also a long-term investment. Maybe not as long, individual trees not as long as a typical building, but still long enough horizon that people want to be sure that 5 years from now there's water available for them, and 10 years from now, and 15, and so on. And so this shift toward tree crops, if you look at the data from between 2000 and 2010 from DWR, it looks like there's been an increase of almost 10% in the acreage of tree crops. And in the valley here, in the 8-county San Joaquin Valley, we're looking at probably about 40% of irrigated lands now that are in permanent crops. So that's a substantial investment related to needs for reliable water supply. So it changes this, in that sense, it changes the demand equation to much more need for reliable supplies. Obviously it's a challenge not to have reliable supplies for annual crops, but it's less of an immediate investment loss. And then on the supply side, I think it changes the equation too, because these crops are able to support deeper wells because they're generating more revenue, and so folks are able to drill deeper for ag wells than was typically the case with crops that are not generating the same amount of revenue per acre. So it can increase the pressure also on thinking about what are the groundwater reserves like. Now, in thinking about solutions, I'll just note that this idea of water adequacy and having a sort of land use check on investments before they happen was something that was included for agriculture in the Association of California Water Agencies proposal on groundwater that came out earlier this year, where they noted precisely this issue of the increase in permanent crops and the investment role of those, and suggested that one might want to think about permitting for that, and thinking about the permitting in terms of water availability, the same that it does now for urban and suburban development. I'll say that this is more uncharted territory in the sense that there's always been permitting of municipal and industrial development. What changed with those laws I talked about was just, do you do a screening for water availability, whereas agriculture, farmers are not required to get a permit now for what they plant, as long as the land is zoned agriculture. So it's a little bit different, and it would require some different changes. That did not survive in the legislation that finally passed that proposal. I think, there's what we're starting to see more is folks thinking about how do you manage access to groundwater rather than permitting the particular activities, land use activities in agriculture. And my sense is that's probably the direction that things are going to evolve. The law does require, and Dave's going to talk about it more, getting into doing a plan that gets to long-term sustainability of the groundwater reserves. Right now, rural counties typically only regulate wells for safety. So you have to follow certain rules to make sure that you're drilling a well according to safety and public health and safety norms, but not in relation to how much water you're going to take out of it. But you are starting to see some discussions about this. Stanislaus County passed an ordinance, and that was about groundwater, and that was part of the discussion last year. They ended up only restricting exports, which is the typical way that rural counties sort of do restrict groundwater use. Right now in California, most rural counties have a groundwater export restriction. Stanislaus ended up stopping with that, but discussions have now been starting up again on whether there should be also some permitting of new wells in relation to decisions on well permitting in relation to the quantity use. Merced is having those kinds of discussions now. Paso Robles over in San Luis Obispo County has an emergency ordinance right now that is not allowing any new irrigation or development wells. It's a 2-year ordinance while they're working out the development of a new groundwater management plan. My own sense is that I think that some kind of restriction on groundwater access is going to have to be part of the implementation of the groundwater law, and that's probably going to require, rather than a purely voluntary approach, it's probably going to require some way of allocating shares to people, to water users, that they have a certain share, and then if they want to use more than that, they may have to either pay more in order to be able to use those, so that the agency can use those revenues to augment supplies in some way, or they buy shares from someone else. And you can think about allocating shares in a couple of ways. One of them is sort of grandfathering, and that's kind of been the way the discussion has gone so far, in these counties where there's been a discussion about limiting access to wells. The idea is, it's the new guys that are going to be restricted, and whatever is already here is okay. Another approach is to kind of follow the correlative rights principle that applies to groundwater in a general way, which would be to say sort of per acre, whatever the sustainable yield is, you divide that up per acre, and everybody has, whether it's a couple acre feet per acre or whatever as their starting basis, and then allow trading there and allow people to pay more for more. I'll say that the experience in managed basins, both within California and some other places like Arizona, suggests that when you do allocate shares like this, it can encourage trading, and it can encourage bringing in revenues and investments in conjunctive use. So in California, most of those examples are urban, but you do have in the Mojave Basin a mix of urban and ranching, and you have very active trading in that basin since it's been adjudicated. And in the Pacro Valley, over in the Central Coast, which is a groundwater management area that does have some limits on use, you've been seeing that people pay to pump, and that those revenues are being used to develop alternative sources to recharge the basin. So none of these are going to happen overnight or be easy, but there are some models out there that probably are going to be useful for California in thinking about the next steps on this. Thank you.